Chillicothe in the late 1930s was a busy place. The Depression was not over yet, and people who had jobs appreciated them and didn't mind working hard. Beardsley's on the north side of the square sold wallpaper, paint, and the trimmings. People did their own wallpapering in those days. You could paper a whole room for $2. Later, this became the Lee Meek Wallpaper Store. This film was apparently made to promote business in Chillicothe, and the photographer went from one end of town to the other, taking pictures of people at work. Ivan Hastings' cleaning and tailoring shop was across from the post office on Locust Street. Walt Edwards is going to bring in one of his suits and take another one home. It has been cleaned and pressed. He ran a cafe just a few doors south. Hastings also took measurements for tailor-made suits. In those days, it was just as inexpensive to have a tailor-made suit as it was to buy it from J.C. Penney's or Montgomery Ward. There were no polyesters in those days. Most of the suits were wool. One of these men is a Walton. Hastings Cleaners is no more. The building is now a garage. Up Locust Street, a block north, is the Clark Drug Store. This was started by O.P. Clark and was operated by his son Perry Clark. There was a marble soda fountain inside and several ice cream chairs and tables, so it was quite a gathering place. Clark's also had the fastest delivery boy in town. Phone in for your medicine and you'll get it PDQ. Hayes Newman worked behind the counter, and at first he had only one flavor of ice cream at the fountain. He would ask children as they came in, "What flavor would you like of ice cream?" And they would reply, "What flavor do you have?" He would reply, "Vanilla, vanilla, and vanilla." Then they would take their choice. Ice cream cones were a real bargain at 2 scoops for a nickel. If you were a real sophisticate, you might ask for a glass of Coca-Cola or root beer instead. And the big spenders might have an ice cream soda. The fountain had many choices to offer. It all tasted good. Even the babies liked it. Perry Clark is pictured on the left with some of his employers and customers. Drugstores sold all kinds of items in those days. Perhaps you noticed the fans in the window. There was no air conditioning. When hot weather came, people fanned themselves or bought electric fans. Every house had a front porch in those days, and most had a front porch swing.
On the same side of Locust Street was Malloy's jewelry store. Every man still wore a gold watch in his vest pocket, and Malloy's was the place to buy your watches. Women and girls wore the wristwatches. Monty Malloy and his wife were the young couple who ran the store. Don Frederick was their clerk, and later he bought them out. Malloy's carried engagement and wedding rings, and noticed that it was also the official Wabash Railroad time station. Railroad time was very important in those days, since Chillicothe was still a railroad town and watches had to be accurate. Lockets were big and lavaliers for your best girlfriend. Jewelry in the 1930s was a luxury item, and only people with financial security could afford it. Now we are over at City Hall and are about to meet the Chillicothe Police Department. It is a summer day, and the policemen are all dressed up in their full uniform. There is Ed Baldwin and Police Chief Morris Dorney, who was chief from 1900 to 1945. One of the men is Kinky Dawkins, and the young fellow is Cecil Campbell. He liked hanging around City Hall so much that he went back to be mayor in the 1970s. Frank Bales also worked in City Hall. The City Hall was built in 1926 and was the pride of the city. It not only housed the city offices, but also the city auditorium and the city jail. Here are some of the people who worked for the city. They all came to work the day the photographer was there. Meet George Devers, Walter Edwards, Roger Higgins, Lester Carter, and Ernie Wiseman. And there is Bernard Rupp and Irwin Woodward and Leland Sidden. Could be that some of these people were city councilmen, or maybe just a businessman's committee come to advise the mayor. C.G. Carnahan was mayor from 1935 through 1939. He was followed by Murray Wendell, who served 4 years. It is just a block up the street to the Chillicothe Iron Company, which was an important part of the building that went on in Chillicothe. They were located at the corner of Elm and Calhoun, and the building is still standing today, although most of the operations have moved out to Ryan Lane in southeast Chillicothe. The plant was owned by C.T. Botsford. Some of the employees are D. and Loy Lahan. The man in the flat-top straw hat is Mr. Botsford, the boss. During the Depression, there was very little new construction being done in Livingston County, but bridges and railroads had to be kept up, and highways were being built in the state.
The most famous spot in Chillicothe in the 1930s was the Chillicothe Business College. It was known from coast to coast by the signs in every state that said, "So many miles to Chillicothe Business College." It had been established first as a normal school in 1890 by the first Alan Moore, but was changed into a business college in 1910. The school was at its height of enrollment in the late 1930s, with students flocking in from all over the United States for courses in telegraphy, stenography, business law, penmanship, spelling, and bookkeeping. By the 1930s, one building had burned and left only the old bell. The largest building was the gymnasium. Here we see some of the 2,000 students as they leave the building. There were young people in a hurry. They knew where they were going as soon as they received their diploma from Chillicothe Business College. They were moving up in the world toward a job and success. The dining hall was the building that was at the far north end of the campus. Meals were cheap and perhaps starchy. J.D. Rice was a popular teacher who was known far and wide for his penmanship skills. The boys' dormitory was located south of the gymnasium and was called Empire Hall. Minerva Hall was the newest dormitory. It still stands as a nursing home called Longblum's. Many students lived in private homes in Chillicothe. The Lambert Manufacturing Company now makes gloves in the remaining buildings on the campus of what was once the nation's largest business college. Mort Cathy was one of the teachers, as were many other Chillicothe citizens. The school boasted a football team called the Ducks. They played junior college teams, and usually homecoming was with Kemper Military Academy. There were many extracurricular activities, and students could choose from a wide variety for participation. The stadium, now known as the Jerry Litton Memorial Stadium, started out as a part of Chillicothe Business College. Madeline Roberts, a pretty Chillicothe girl, was among the students. Perhaps the big success of Chillicothe Business College was due to the fact that Chillicothe was served by many railroads. There were at one time as many as a dozen trains arriving in Chillicothe from all directions. There were main lines, the CB&Q or Burlington, the Wabash, and the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul. By the 1930s, there were cars and highways, but many small towns still had only 2 years of high school and little or no vocational training. So students who could not attend a four-year college in those Depression years were attracted to Chillicothe Business College. The college lasted through World War II and trained GIs, but by the end of the war it closed its doors because high schools everywhere were offering business colleges. Two other colleges at that time were Jackson University and Maupin's Business College. Alan Moore Sr. was president of the college, better known as Baldy. He always had a smile on his face.
We leave the business college to visit the C.H. Atkinson Paving Company. Missouri had had mud roads everywhere in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and it wasn't until about 1930 that the first paved roads were completed. By the late 1930s, Atkinson Company had built roads all over North Missouri, and Highway 65 and 36 had made Chillicothe the trade center of North Missouri. Just as the railroads had contributed to the growth of the town back in the 1800s, paved roads brought growth in the 1930s. There was a Livingston County Memorial Library in the 1930s too. It was located on Calhoun Street between Washington and Cherry Streets on the north side, and the house still stands. Women's clubs have been instrumental in getting the library started. Watch for Cheryl Lee Reinhardt among those patronizing the library, and you will see Mrs. Raymond Russell, who was instrumental in getting the library started, along with Mrs. Mabel Reynolds and Mrs. Davis, who was the librarian. The library was a busy and popular place in those days. Later, the library moved to the southwest corner of Jackson and Washington Street, and eventually to its present location on Locust Street when the new post office was built. We are back on Washington Street now and on the west side of the square looking south. Things were moving at a leisurely pace, and if you wanted to sit for a while, a park bench was provided. Notice the latest models in cars. Horn's drugstore was in the middle of the block. The two Rickerson brothers and Joe Kester worked there. Bill Olenhouse was a Barnsdale dealer on North Washington Street. Later, Bill ran a nursery at this location until he retired. Don Horn was the proprietor of Horn's drugstore. Drugstores in the 1930s still featured a lot of patent medicines. Lydia Pinkham's compound for ailing ladies, Carter's little liver pills, and all kinds of liniments. Chillicothe was famous for Snare's Relief, a pungent, smelly liniment invented and sold right here in Chillicothe with a secret ingredient that died with the inventor. Labor was cheap in those days, and a favorite job for young men was learning to be a soda jerk. It was a great place to gain work experience and have good time too, until the boss said, "Okay, boys, it's time to get back to work." The post office was the busiest place in town. Letters cost 3 cents in 1939, and postcards were a penny each. Rural mail carriers were still fighting mud roads to get the mail delivered. Some of the postal employees were Nellie Bondrer, a clerk, Scott Vorbeck, Beth Nothnagel, Bill Killian, carriers, and of course there was Postmaster Joe Stewart. The mail came in from every direction by rail, but you could have speedier service by airmail if you wished. One spot that hasn't changed much in the past 45 years is the Strand Coffee Shop, now the Carriage House. Then as now, it was a popular spot for that morning cup of coffee or noon meal. The waitresses in their black uniforms and perky white aprons, with smiling faces and sausage curls, were efficient. A hearty lunch could be had for 50 cents, and a steak dinner might cost 85 cents or $1. Coffee was 5 cents a cup. Most families ate out only on very special occasions. Now let us visit the powerhouse gang. Down between the two main railroad lines was the city light and power plant. It took a lot of coal shoveling to keep things humming. Electricity had first come to Chillicothe back in 1885. The electric plant in those days ran until midnight on 6 days a week, but on Sunday there was no electricity. If you wanted to go to church on Sunday night, you apparently had to light a kerosene lamp. By the 1930s, all the town people had electricity 7 days a week, but rural electrification was just beginning in 1939. Farm families were still using gasoline or kerosene lamps or Delco lights and gasoline engines. Chillicothe had once had a street railway back in the 19th century, but it was not powered by electricity. It consisted of 4 cars and 10 little mules, which hauled people from one depot to another or up to the square or the fairgrounds. May Durfee was the office girl at the power plant. Other workers were Roger Higgins and Dee Sherrill. The first telephone system in Chillicothe had begun back in 1886 with 16 phones, but by 1930 telephones were common and everything was up to date in Chillicothe. Who have we here? It looks like some of the city fathers out for a stroll. There's Ernest Harvey, Lester Carter, Harry Graham, Fred Gunby, Alan Moore, Dr. Donald Dowell, and J.D. Engelman. Do you suppose they are plotting some big project to get Chillicothe booming, or are they just reminiscing about the 1937 centennial that Chillicothe had celebrated, and perhaps making plans for the second 100 years? Perhaps they are just out for an inspection tour of Chillicothe businesses and just happen to walk by the camera. There were problems in the 1930s in the county government because many homeowners could not pay their taxes. County records at that time reflect the attempts of property owners to survive. Sometimes the taxes were reduced about 50%. The county court paid $3.45 per 100 board feet for bridge lumber and $4.19 a ton for coal during the 1930s. The county at this time had a pauper fund which was often used. There were many court orders for $2 or $3 for groceries, and there was also a poor farm.
It is time the ladies got in front of the camera too, and they are apparently grouping by clubs. The VFW Auxiliary, decided to wear white uniforms and ties at their neck. Another group was the American Legion Auxiliary. The women are all dressed up in their best printed voile dresses and rayon stockings. Nylons were not invented until a year later, and silk hose were very expensive. So most women wore cotton stockings or rayon hose that bagged at the knees and ankles. No pantyhose yet, they hadn't been invented. Mrs. Frank Fay, Miss Kate Kennison, and Kate Cornu are in this group. In the 1930s, every well-dressed woman wore a hat and gloves when she went out. If it was too expensive to buy a new hat each year, she got a new veil or a new flower and trimmed up last year's hat. Not only the women, but the men, too, wore hats so they would not get sunstroke. Dress materials were cottons, usually dimities or voiles or gams or calicos. Linen was hot. This little girl wants Shirley Temple curls. Shirley Temple was the favorite movie star of this decade. Here's Nellie Bonder and Faye Backey in this picture. The ladies always have a terrible time deciding who is going to stand on the front row. No, you're shorter than I am. You stand there. I'm bigger. I want to be in the back row. Do you like the style of the dresses? Perhaps some of them were homemade, and some of the cotton prints may have started life out as a flour sack or a chicken feed sack. It took 3 or 4 sacks to make a dress, but this was a favorite occupation of farmers' wives who would instruct their husbands to buy chicken feed in the blue plaid check or the rose-colored flowered pattern. These women are all dressed up and decided that they want their picture taken today. Notice some of them have tight little curls. They get them from sleeping on metal rollers every night. Beauty comes before comfort. Perhaps some of these ladies were members of a woman's club, or could be they were courthouse secretaries. If so, they all get back to work. Coffee break is over. Courthouse secretaries in those days worked for $1 or $1.50 a day. Bridge employees who worked on county bridges made $2 or $2.50 a day. This, of course, was in the days before equal rights. There weren't too many jobs available for women in the 30s. A girl had about 4 choices. She could become a school teacher, a nurse, a secretary, or a housewife. She didn't think of getting married and having a career, too. Even school boards frowned upon hiring married school teachers. School teachers. Isn't that a beautiful baby? Do you realize that by now she's at least 45? There's a young man from the farm. The most popular dance in the 1930s was the Big Apple. Do you suppose that is what Wanda Dar is dancing for us now?
Sugar and spice and everything nice. That is what little girls are made of. And they ate sticky buns and donuts and cookies that came from Crookshank's bakeries. Home ovens of the 1930s were not as dependable, and cake mixes had not been invented, so it was easier to go to Crookshank's for your baked goods, where you could buy a loaf of bread for a nickel. The bakery trucks are loading up to take goodies all over the surrounding county. Did you ever see such fast, efficient workers? There's an assembly line. Gene Crookshanks and Leland Pirtle are the speedy workers. Only old-timers can remember when you could buy 6 of the day-old donuts for 5 cents. Now that was eating. They seem to have trouble deciding who's going to stand in front, too. Next, we visit the Goodrich Tire Store. No nylon tires yet, no tubeless tires either. Just plain old rubber tires and inner tubes. Beefy Eubanks and Bill Merriman are the workers here. The place to stay in Chillicothe was a Strand Hotel, where you could get a room with a bath. There were no motels in town except for the Midway tourist camp located where Queen City is now. At the Strand, there was a bellboy to carry in your bag.
The Skelly Oil Company at the corner of Cherry and Jackson still looks familiar, but perhaps the service was more complete in those days when people worked for 25 cents an hour. You could get all your windows washed, your headlights shined, your oil checked, your radiator filled, your battery water checked, and your running board swept off, as well as air for your tires. Now that was service. There were restrooms available and gasoline was cheap, sometimes as low as 10 cents a gallon. Pete Pearson and the operator Sam McDowell are shown with some of the other employees. These 1930 Euro model cars practiced economy and got a lot of miles to the gallon, no matter whether you drove a sedan or a coupe with a rumble seat or a roadster or one of the new convertibles. Skelly would meet your every need. There's been an important meeting going on at the Methodist Church. From the satisfied looks on the faces of these men, it must have been a fried chicken and apple pie dinner. This might have been the Rotary Club. There's Louis Potts, the minister of the church. The building was still a church in those years. It was sold to the Masonic Lodge 20 years later. Joe Stewart and Henry Boehner and Palmer Milbank look like they've enjoyed their meal.
In 1936, a dinner at Wheeling by the Baptist women cost 25 cents and offered roast beef, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, 7 other kinds of vegetables, hot rolls, macaroni and cheese, gravy, 8 kinds of salad, 5 kinds of pie, and 10 kinds of cake. Whew. Down on Washington Street at the corner of First Street was the Consumers Ice Company. In the 1880s, when people needed ice, they bought it from the Gladue family, who cut it out of the river and ponds and stored it in sawdust until summer. In the 1900s, ice became a manufactured product, and Consumers Ice Company served a big demand. Ice came in 300-pound blocks and could be chipped down to appropriate size. Ice wagons then hauled it to all the homes in town. You put a card in your window indicating whether you wanted 25, 50, 75, or 100 pounds of ice on a particular day. Mr. Wiley ran the ice plant and employed young men who had lots of muscle. This was especially a challenge to prospective football players to help them get into shape. The Gladue family ran the delivery service, and here is Raymond and Victor doing their daily exercise. Patrons could also go to the ice plant and pick up ice if they were going to make a big freezer of ice cream or entertain. Homemade ice cream socials were really big, and every club or church group had at least one during the summer months. Running the ice plant was somewhat of a seasonal business, thriving in the summer, a bit slower in the winter. Baseball was big in Chillicothe. This is the American Legion ball team that Oscar Case coached. There was some real talent in these young athletes. 2 years later, in 1941, they were second in the state behind the St. Louis team, whose members included Yogi Berra and Joe Garagiola. H. Earl Barnes coached another team. Games were played at the baseball diamond just south of Simpson Park. On a hot summer night, when the house was too warm for comfort, the citizens of Chillicothe went out to the ballpark and caught the breeze while watching home team bat and run. There was probably no Little League in those days, but younger children didn't have organized playgrounds. They could go over to the shade of Simpson Park. Mr. Charlie Mast was park superintendent, and it was the beauty spot of Chillicothe. Earlier in the 1930s, Civilian Conservation Corps young men had done dirt work and built bridges. The swimming pool was large and located on the same spot where the tennis courts are now. This was a favorite spot for the bathing beauties of the 1930s, whether they wanted to take the plunge or just lie in the sun. Camera tricks were possible then, too. Look closely. There's no bikinis to be seen. Most of the women's bathing suits were made of wool and had demure skirts. Sometimes moths did get into them. Teenagers have not changed much since the 1930s.
You went to the Chillicothe Hospital on 11th Street. The nurses there were cheerful and happy to see you. and there was a shady lawn outside where you could take a nap if you wanted to. Ethel Leslie was one of the nurses at this time. This hospital was completed in 1937, so it was still quite new when the picture was taken. The original Chillicothe Hospital was built in 1889 by the Sisters of St. Mary. The sisters enlarged their frame hospital twice, adding new equipment, and operated the hospital until 1916, when Dr. H.M. Grace and Dr. A.J. Simpson bought the hospital. In 1936, Dr. Grace and Mrs. Simpson donated the entire plant and grounds to the city of Chillicothe. Chillicothe High School was built in 1924 and was first used in January 1925. Wake up, it's time to get up. The school board at the time this picture was taken included Marvin England, Frank McCalmont, Dr. Clarence Grace, and Dr. Barney. The building cost $300,000 when it was built. It replaced Old Central High, which was located on Elm Street. In 1939, there were also 4 ward schools in each of the 4 wards in town. Chillicothe always had music, and here's a band directed by Eugene Solly performing a Saturday night concert on the west side of the courthouse. The sweetest place in Chillicothe was the Brownfield and Bird Ice Cream and Candy Factory on Webster Street. Older Chillicothe citizens mouthed still water when you mentioned the famous English dipped chocolates. There were no synthetic substitutes then. Ice cream was made with real cream and candy from the purest ingredients. Shirley Brownfield, owner, was a favorite of all the kids in town. The firm had started on North Washington Street in the 1880s. Roy Kubeck drove the truck, and Harry Marr was an employee. Producer's Creamery, located on Vine Street, was a busy place. Many farmers in the 1930s sold cream to the Producer's Creamery, bringing it to town once or twice a week. At the same time, they brought their eggs and other produce to sell. The creamery also had trucks which went out to pick up cream and milk. There were a few grade A dairies, but the creamery made ice cream, milk, cheese, butter, and buttermilk. It was the first cooperative in Chillicothe. Among the employees were Merle Jones, Arthur Seiss, Leland Pirtle, Lucetta Culling, Angelina Carroll. There's Leroy Van Dusen, Wesley Griggs, and the manager, John Cook. Specialized farming hadn't begun yet in the 1930s. Every farm had horses, mules, pigs, cows, and perhaps a few sheep as well as a herd of chickens, and of course a garden. Some farmers' wives still made their own butter and brought it to town along with their cream and eggs, but discriminating housewives preferred creamery butter. Speaking of food, the Chat and Nibble was one of the favorite places to eat. It was located between Scrooby Hardware and the Constitution Tribune in the 500 block of Washington Street, just north of the Masonic Building, which housed the Ritz Theater. Sampling the wares of the Chat and Nibble are Francis Carter, Wilson Miller, and Bob Scrooby. Ivan Walker was the operator, and he was inviting customers in to try some of these 5 and 10-cent hamburgers, a delicious ice cream soda, or a piece of cherry pie. Sodas cost 15 cents, and cherry pie could be had for 10 cents. Pies were always made with lard in those days before people had heard of cholesterol and heart attacks. No meal was complete without a pie, and there was at least 20 varieties that the well-stocked restaurant could carry. There were not many ladies' ready-to-wear stores in the 1930s. since most women sewed their own clothing or had a dressmaker, but for the very stylish, Wanda Dar and Jane Stepp are modeling the latest styles from New York and Hollywood. Leon Furrer managed the dress shop where the smartly dressed women of Chillicothe bought their ready-mades.
Millbank Mills is perhaps the oldest firm in Chillicothe, still in operation. It was started in 1868 by George Millbank and was located on North Washington Street where Kentucky Fried Chicken and Hy-Vee stores now stand. Silver Moon Flour was the Millbank brand, and here's Dean Murin taking a grain test for moisture. Farmers brought in wheat and exchanged it for flour. The mill also made buckwheat flour for pancakes, cattle and hog feed, and even dog food later on. In the 1930s, dogs were fed scraps from the table. Hubert Stewart was an employee, and John Millbank and his son Palmer were the owners and operators of the mill. A familiar sight in Chillicothe was the R.J. Hurley Lumber Company at the corner of Elm and Jackson Streets. Lumber was cheap at $3.45 per 100 board feet for bridge lumber. The West 3rd Street Bridge across Thompson River was built for $2,240. Ralph Head and Tom Posey are employees and are busy loading lumber for building projects. That is Wilbur Parrish working with them. Few homes were built during the 1930s, but those that were built inexpensively. Earl Bradbury, a leading contractor, could build a 2-story house for $4,000 or less. When the Hurley Lumber Company burned, it was the biggest blaze Chillicothe had ever seen. Another popular eating place was the Sugar Bowl, located on Locust Street. In those carefree days of the 1930s, people didn't count calories or worry about cholesterol. They just ate and ate and ate and enjoyed eating. Ice cream was the favorite food, and they savored every bite. The dogs stayed around in case someone wanted to share. What? No leash laws then? A dog's life must not have been so bad, and who knows, if a dog is lucky, some cats might just happen along. Carl Shirley operated the Sugar Bowl. Does it seem to you that these pictures have really centered around food and eating? People didn't have TV to talk about in those days. Of course, they did discuss what Amos and Andy said on the radio the night before, or what songs Kate Smith sang before she signed off with When the Moon Comes Over. The Citizens Bank stood on the same corner where it now stands. D. Minnis, in the Texaco uniform, is coming out of the door. Money was scarce in the 1930s. Do you suppose all of these people were going in to make a loan or making a weekly deposit of $1? People saved money by joining Christmas savings plans. Thrift was the byword in the 1930s, and scarcely anyone had heard of installment buying or pay-as-you-go, and credit cards had not been invented. The employees of the bank were Ed Solly, John Cusick, Don Schooler, Edgerton Welch, and Owsley Welch. Ira Hedrick was president. The Hedrick Medical Center was named for him as its benefactor. For sheer enjoyment and entertainment value, there was nothing to equal a pie-eating contest on the courthouse lawn. Teenage boys and younger were eager and willing contestants, and the pies were made by the best cooks in town. Pick your favorite kind and go. The winner and the cleanup. Do you suppose there was a prize, or was it just getting to eat all that pie? Satisfaction enough.
Everybody loves a parade. Here comes the high school band. They're followed by Girl Scouts and kids on bicycles. Watch for Pat Lindsay, now Burton. Could this have been the forerunner to the Kiwanis Kids Day Parade? Helen Ann Skinner was the drum major for the band. Everybody mind your step. Decorate your bicycles. Bring your pets. Even goats are welcome. Watch for Barney Savage in a white shirt. There's Barney. More dogs, more bicycles. More proud mamas watching. Are you still hungry? Those hardy citizens of the 1930s loved to eat. Here's Woodard's Bakery on the east side of Locust Street. Irvin Woodard was the proprietor, and every Saturday there was a drawing for a free cake. Woodard's Best, several layers thick. Everyone had a favorite cake: Lady Baltimore, spice, apple, burnt sugar, chocolate, or devil's food. Some cooks guarded the recipes and passed them on only to their daughters. There were a few thermostatically controlled ovens, and you never knew how a cake baked in a wood range or a kerosene stove would turn out. Did you know that sliced bread was invented in Chillicothe? The first bread slicing machine was put into operation in May 1928 by a Chillicothe baking company with Frank Bench as proprietor. The bakery was located at First and Elm Streets. The problem was that the bread wrapper had to be fastened with a wire pin that left rust spots on the bread. So the idea was picked up by a man from St. Louis who perfected the invention and started manufacturing slicing machines. In the meantime, Chillicothe citizens bought their bakeries at Woodard's Bakery. Now it is Sunday morning. St. Columba's Catholic Church is letting out morning mass. This building was erected in 1878, making it one of the older churches in the city. There is Bill Marquet among the parishioners. Notice that every woman and girl has her head covered. The Chillicothe Catholic Church was started by a missionary priest, Father Hogan, in 1857. He built the first Catholic church in the south part of town. But in May 1860, Bishop Gorman of Nebraska dedicated St. Columba's Church. Later in September, Father Hogan was named bishop of the new diocese. This was Father Owens. Father Owens. An attractive smaller church was the Christian Science Reading Room on Locust Street. The Presbyterian Church was built in 1892 and used until 1951. Andrew Preston was its minister. Grace Episcopal Church acquired their property in 1859, but did not build until 1870. This is the oldest church building in Chillicothe. Many of the stained glass windows were installed in the last century and represent fine examples of 19th century church art. The youth choir is singing in the Episcopal tradition based on the Book of Common Prayer. In 1980, Grace Church was placed on the National Register of Historic Places.
The First Baptist Church was located on Vine and Clay Streets. This building was built in 1903 and was used until 1967. The original cost was $16,525. Reverend Trower was the pastor in the late 1930s. The Baptists had started their first church in Chillicothe back in 1844 under the leadership of William Walden a circuit-riding preacher. They shared a building with the Christian church at first, building their own brick building in 1856. Up the street a block to the west was the Elm Street Methodist Church, originally called the Methodist Church South. George Shadwick was the pastor in the 1930s. The Southern Methodists had held their first religious meetings in the county back in 1833. Their first church was on Locust Street, but it had been destroyed by fire. This church building on Elm Street was built in 1903 and was used even after the North and South churches merged in 1954. It was used until 1960 when the congregation moved to the new church on Walnut Street. First Methodist Church, the original North Church or Methodist Episcopal, was located at the corner of Webster and Cherry Streets. The choir seems to be in a hurry to shed their choir robes. Perhaps it was a warm day. Mr. Meek was the head usher. There is Henry Boehner, Dr. Lewis Potts, the minister, and Lloyd Shannon, the assistant minister, followed by Lester Carter. When the two Methodist churches merged, the Masonic Lodge bought and remodeled this building. In the days before television, commercial messages were available. One of the popular places to advertise was at the theater between the newsreel and the cartoon, or just before coming attractions. So in that tradition, we now end with some commercial messages as we bid farewell to life in Chillicothe in 1939, those simple, quiet days that are lost forever.